welcome back. This is another review video for a video called, if I can see, I've got my camera on a bunch of boxes here, it's hiding there. Science experiment proves afterlife is real. I can tell you straight away that won't be the case. No scientific experiment has proven the afterlife is real. No science experiment has proven the afterlife is not real. All we can say is that there is evidence for or against that possibility. So, science experiment proves afterlife is real? Definitely not. But we'll see what the content is, and I'll give you my thoughts on it. As you can see, my background is different. That's because we're now in our new house, and I've got my little office here. Say little office, it would have been the dining room, but we don't really use the dining room. So I've got a nice big open office here. I've got my piano over there, and it's all nice. Pictures of my little dogs up. I want to get my little Foxy up here. Find a little table to stick him up so you've got a little Foxy face there. I like him to be in the video. It's just adds a little nice little gimmick to it, doesn't it? So this video is, as I say, from the Infographics show, very popular channel. Go over, have a look, and let's jump in to see what they bring forward.
We've all thought about what happens after we die. Do we go to a place in the sky and are welcomed by family and friends? Do we get reincarnated as a beautiful butterfly? Is there nothing at all? At this point in time, no one can definitively say what happens to your consciousness or spirit after you die. However, doctors such as Sam Parnia at NYU Langone Health have discovered evidence that after the body dies, your consciousness may continue on.
Important distinction there that they've made from the title to the actual content. The title is "Science Experiment Proves Afterlife is Real," which is not true, but they do say in here that quite rightly that nobody can quantify if there is survival or not as of yet. Which I agree with, and second of all, they're saying that, for example, Dr. Sam Parnia's experiments may provide evidence that life or that the consciousness can continue after the body has died, which is a lot better than saying it proves that it does. It doesn't. It may suggest that it can.
Is this proof there is an afterlife?
No.
Can science provide evidence for the existence of consciousness after the body shuts down?
Yes.
Let's find out.
Possibly.
Someone is considered clinically dead when their heart stops beating. It's called death by cardiopulmonary criteria.
Which is true. However, we must be aware that after the heart stops, there's still a 30-second or so window that the cortex of the brain is still active and could produce conscious awareness. If we take the assumption that the cortex does produce consciousness, the brainstem, which is the autonomous part of the brain responsible for things that we don't really consciously control, like heart rate and other things, breathing and things like that. That can go on for another 3 minutes or so, but it's not believed that consciousness is related to the brainstem at the moment, because all the correlations are shown to the cortex of the brain, which shuts down after 30 seconds. So we must be aware that clinical death, which means the heart stops, does not mean that the brain is instantly flatlined, 30 seconds or so.
Death occurs in this way because the heart stops pumping oxygen-rich blood and nutrients around the body, which causes all the organs and tissues to shut down. Advances in medical practices such as CPR and defibrillators have made death reversible in a sense, and it's believed right now that after the heart stops, you still have 5 to 10 minutes before your brain cells die and your brain damage becomes irreversible. However,
is that true? That sounds very, 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 very high amount of time. From what Dr. Gary Habermas mentions, the studies seem to show that it's up to 3 minutes, being generous, for the brainstem to completely shut down, and the cortex, as I say, up to 30 seconds. 5 minutes minimum. I don't know if you could say that's accurate or not. Maybe for the entire brain to shut down, maybe. But again, 3 minutes is what was given to me. I think that seems a bit high. I'm not certain, but I'll have to look over the studies again.
Recent research suggests that 5 to 10 minutes worth of brain activity after the heart stops beating is incorrect. Instead, a person may have hours or even days of brain activity after their heart stops. If this is true, then what's happening in your brain when you're clinically declared dead? What is your consciousness doing? This paradox is what medical researchers are trying to figure out. What is consciousness?
Hours or days after the heart stops? I don't see how that... I've never seen that before in studies. I'll have to have another look and see. Maybe more recent studies have come out to suggest that, but I've never seen that. As I say, the only figure I've got is 3 minutes, and that's based off of Gary Habermas's look through the literature on the subject. I'm sure Sam Parnia gave that figure as well.
does it lie within the body? Your consciousness makes you, you. It is undeniably a product of the brain, but we are not entirely sure where your consciousness is manifested and kept within your nervous system. Is it in the...
I think it's a bit of a difficult thing to say that consciousness is definitely produced by the brain. Certainly the brain is responsible for kind of developing an ego of what oneself is. Whether you call that consciousness or an ego or an identity, I don't know. I'd consider consciousness to be the sense of I am without context. So the ego is what I would consider what I believe myself to be, personality, beliefs, all of that sort of thing, which, yes, it is certainly, again, very highly correlated with brain activity, and we can measure how the brain interacts and how it relates to our sense of identity. Again, that's correlatory, so we can't say that it definitely is produced by the brain, only that the brain is certainly very closely involved. But yeah, as they say, they can't pinpoint where consciousness is in the brain, only the neural correlates of it. And if you define consciousness as I do, as that sense of I, the sense of being something, of what it is to be in and of itself, that's a more tricky one.
The muscle tissue, the synapses, or is it the energy flowing between the nerves that gives us consciousness? Because of countless research studies, we know that when we have a thought, parts of our brain send chemical and electrical signals through the nerve cells. Since thoughts and consciousness are closely related, our essence may be contained within the cells and chemicals in the brain. This means your sense of self and what makes you you could just be bundles of proteins and organic compounds.
Could be, but again, the brick wall there is the hard problem. How can non-conscious matter, which is all our brains are, fundamentally non-conscious matter with a series of on and off switches, how can that generate a sense of being? That's the hard problem, and that's what these kind of ideas always come back crashing towards and get stopped up at. No mechanism for how it could possibly happen, no mechanism for how consciousness could exist beyond the brain at the moment, so therefore neither is more plausible than the other in terms of, I suppose, in terms of a base explanation. However, there is, to me, a lot more evidence in support of the latter due to the experiences that we've seen that don't fit at all with any kind of emergence model of materialistic basis, like veridical perception that shouldn't take place in the materialistic paradigm. So to me, the latter of brain does not produce consciousness is more parsimonious. However, we also don't have a mechanism as to how that could not be, or how that could be. Therefore, though, we shouldn't say that because we don't have a mechanism, therefore we should dismiss it and assume that certainly the brain does create it, because we don't have a mechanism for that either, how that could possibly happen.
They ask, when the brain shut down and the cells start to die, does our consciousness go with it? That's the question Dr. Samparnia and others are trying to figure out. Can one brain cell hold your consciousness, or do you need millions of brain cells to create who you are? Again, that seems to be assuming that in some way the brain does create it. Do you need, can consciousness be produced by one cell? Can one cell hold consciousness, or do you need a lot of cells to produce consciousness? That's the two questions they gave there. There is a third, or do you not necessarily need those cells to produce it, but do you need those cells to interact with it or experience it, I suppose, in the human sense? Parnia states that there's no reason to believe that millions of cells are necessary for your consciousness to exist. It's difficult to quantify, but your consciousness may be contained in every one of your trillions of cells. Just think, every time you lose a brain cell, you may be losing a part of yourself. Spooky, right? If your brain hurts from thinking about what gives you consciousness, stay with me for just a little while longer. Regardless of what part of your brain gives you emotions, personality, and your essence, none of that matters when all of your cells die. So what happens to you after the heart stops beating and your consciousness moves on? Is there an afterlife? Studies have shown that after someone is clinically dead, their consciousness remains in or around the body for a period of time. Since death is not an off switch but more of a slider, you aren't alive one.
See, I'm confused because now they're saying that studies have shown that after the heart has stopped, the consciousness remains around the physical body kind of area. So are they now saying that it is a separate thing? Because just now they were saying that it's definitely kind of. They said that consciousness, our sense of us, earlier in the video said that it's definitely produced by our brain, as far as I can remember it saying. I'm sure it said that. And now they're saying it stays in and around the body, so how can that be? I'm confused of where they're going.
Second and dead the next. When the heart stops, everything else in the body keeps going and then slowly starts to die over time.
It's not you're
this
alive
means
and then
that
you're dead.
for a
It's a process.
significant time after death, death can be fully reversible. Technically, there are loads of people walking around in the afterlife today. People who have had heart attacks or gone into cardiac arrest have had their heart stop. They were dead. Doctors then brought them back to life. Therefore, they are living post-death afterlife. But let's focus on what happens when your heart shuts down for good. When there is no bringing you back, what happens to your consciousness then? If you're dead, you should have no recollection of the time your heart stopped and when it was restarted. However, this is not the case.
That's assuming that a brain is created, or that consciousness is created in the brain, and therefore when the heart stops and the brain stops indefinitely, we shouldn't be aware of that period because, of course, there's no mechanism for our consciousness to exist, so we wouldn't have an experience. So it'd be like going under general anaesthesia and then being out for 4 hours, but you wouldn't have an experience of that 4 hours. You'd just be having the needle in your arm and then suddenly you're awake again. So there's no sense of time. That's what they're saying here.
Been many scientific reports that show people have lucid memories and experiences even while their heart is not beating. Accounts of patients seeing bright lights while they are clinically dead is common. Even though the brain is not receiving oxygen, it would seem that there are still experiences and memories being formed. The process of making observations and then being able to recall those observations is part of what makes you, you. Why do so many people who are dead see a bright light? Maybe it's an experience that gives a glimpse into life after death. People who can recall experiences after their heart stops beating are recalling events from the afterlife. It is entirely possible that the light people see before they die could be the first step toward moving to the afterlife. Other accounts have recorded people hearing full conversations after they were pronounced dead. When their heart is restarted and they regain the ability to talk, these people recount what the doctors and nurses were talking about while trying to bring them back to life.
But in that case, if they were trying to bring them back to life, that would assume that CPR is going on and that blood flow could therefore have been artificially given to the brain, and therefore, could we really use that as evidence? Not strongly.
Brain and your consciousness stop at the time of death, this would not be possible. Perhaps this is happening because the mind is gathering information to prepare your consciousness for the afterlife. There's evidence to suggest that a burst of energy flows through the brain after someone dies.
Not directly in humans, as far as I'm aware, and that was a study done on rats. I can't remember which university, but it showed that at the time of death, there was a surge of brain activity in rats, and possibly a huge release of dimethyltryptamine, which could account for those bursts of electrical activity. However, I don't believe that's been shown to happen in humans.
Maybe your consciousness transitioning to the afterlife. The brain may be carrying out a yet unknown process.
It's another important point. If it does indeed translate over to human experience, that sudden burst of activity, we can't assume that that is causal for the experience. It could be that that's also a correlation that is shown in the brain activity as he said, the consciousness leaves the body or whatever. As I say, if I press the C key on my piano, which is over here now, and it makes the C note sound, and it also shows a little C on my on the LCD display, that doesn't mean that LCD display is causing the sound. It just means that they're correlated. So it could be that the brain activity that is shown, if it is true in humans, could be the process of consciousness leaving the body, not necessarily of the brain producing that experience.
That allows your consciousness to prepare for whatever comes next. After this burst of energy, your brain cells take days to reach a point where they are no longer carrying out basic functions. To be clear, this does not mean the person is not dead. They are, but their consciousness may be transitioning to the afterlife. Another commonality between people who have had...
I'm not sure about that. Maybe it could be that yes, the brain cells do continue to function after a certain, maybe for days. That may be the case, but it's certainly within 30 seconds for cortical activity and 3 minutes for subcortical activity, brainstem, to stop registering on an EEG. Now that might be where I'm kind of mixing up, because it could be that the brain, there is still activity there, but it's not measurable on an EEG, and we need that EEG measurement to know that it's functioning to a level, or at least the cortex is functioning to a level to sustain consciousness. So yes, although it may be still alive, I suppose the cells, they're not operating at a certain level to be registered on an EEG. That may be the case. I'm not certain, but I think that would tie the two together where I'm confused. I'm just kind of talking to myself to try and understand what I mean. I know what I mean.
had post-death experiences is that they often see a guiding figure. The figure varies between people and accounts, but it seems that there is someone or something to guide you after death. Is this figure just a way your mind copes with being dead, or is there more to it? It has been suggested that these guiding figures may just be hallucinations. It's interesting to note that hallucinations are individualistic, so it's odd that multiple people are having similar apparitions taking them into the afterlife.
Now that I'm back getting the delivery from the front door, hallucination they were talking about, weren't they? There's a qualitative difference between the experience of hallucination and these kind of experiences. Certainly it could be hallucinatory, but as the guy said, so many people are having the same experience. Some people share the same hallucination from their own perspective, but have the same kind of thing, which wouldn't make sense with hallucinations. As he said, they're all very independent, individual experiences, so people shouldn't be able to share the same one. But the lucidity and the clarity that's involved with these kind of, I suppose, experiences does not share the properties that we use to define a hallucination. There's no confusion, and there's no kind of random occurrences. It all seems to be very linear, very chronological, and there's order to it. There's no random sudden. I mean, there are in some occasions, but generally there are huge differences between these kind of experiences and what we would normally consider a hallucination.
The only reason we know of these mysterious figures is because people who have been brought back to life through CPR or shocking the heart have told us. Perhaps the guiding figure is a manifestation of the medical professionals that are bringing these people back to life.
Possibly, but also an important phenomena worth noticing is that people, on occasion, when they see deceased people, they can come back with veridical information. For example, Dr. Jan Holden, I'm not going to remember the details, but I'll give it a general idea, was saying of a case where someone saw their father, or we'll say their father, who had died previously, and told him, or told her, I can't remember, to find something that was hidden, a gun that was hidden behind a study bookshelf and had slid down the back. As it was being moved, it slid down the back. And the person that was having the near-death experience had never gone down there, had never seen it, had no reason to think it would be there. So the dad said, yeah, it's here, it's down behind this bookshelf, go and find it and take it away because your mum won't know what to do with it. And she went back and she found it exactly where it was, exactly as described by the deceased person. So that wouldn't make sense if it's kind of a manifestation of the mind or an interpretation of the medical professionals, because there's information there that only the father, the deceased person, would know about at a location far removed from the physical body and is able to be verified later. And so that kind of experience adds depth to these phenomena.
Or maybe there's something in the afterlife that helps us transition from being alive to dead. Some of the most interesting and unexplainable afterlife experiences are accounts of people who claim they've left their dead body and watched themselves be operated on from above. It would be easy to chalk these stories up as hallucinations or that they're made up, but the problem is that the patients can recount vivid details from their out-of-body experience. On more than one occasion, patients who have died can recall events that occurred after their heart stopped. They could explain.
Again, how long after the heart stopped, and was CPR being given at the time? If so, we could say that the brain was receiving enough blood to be at a level to correlate with consciousness. So you could argue that it wasn't genuine evidence, which would be true.
Explain what the doctors were doing at objects in the room. When medical professionals were asked if the memories the patients recalled were accurate, they confirmed that they were. How could someone who was clinically dead have seen and observed so many details? We just don't know. Perhaps it has something to do with what our consciousness is made of. Maybe after we die, our consciousness leaves our body in a form of energy yet to be discovered. This seems unbelievable, but it does serve as a preliminary hypothesis. It
only seems unbelievable when you're tied to a certain metaphysics, I suppose, to a certain philosophy. Because as soon as you indoctrinate yourself with a certain philosophy, say materialism, nothing else beyond that seems possible. Whereas the truth is, the universe is so complex and so vast, we haven't got a clue what really constitutes it all. As I say, in terms of the brain creating consciousness, we don't have any mechanism at all as to how that could possibly happen. But it's taken that it must be the case. So there's equal mechanism for brain creating consciousness and brain, say, receiving consciousness, or brain being a manifestation of consciousness. Neither are mechanismed, I suppose, if that's a word. For me, there's more evidence to support the latter because of these kind of experiences that are verified that certainly wouldn't work with a materialistic understanding if all the details of the phenomena are true and verifiable, which I believe they are. So it may seem unbelievable to the layperson that's kind of brought up in the education system, which is based around material science. And of course, you dismiss it straight away as nonsense until you really start digging into the research and finding out that these are verified phenomena. They're not just anecdotal, they're third-party verified, accounted for perceptions that shouldn't take place in a material framework of consciousness, but do.
How people could have out-of-body experiences. As of yet, there are no real good explanations for how people are able to make accurate observations from outside of their bodies, especially when they're considered clinically dead.
No good explanation from a physical point of view.
You might wonder if these experiences are happening only in certain parts of the world or in certain age groups. It would seem not. Post-death experiences tend to be pretty universal across age groups and location.
And religions and points of view, worldviews, things like that as well.
Data gathered from...
Although the experience differs, seems to be tailored to what the mind is expecting to happen. Doesn't mean that the mind is producing it, it means that mind is influencing it. So people who are Christians may see Jesus, may see what they would expect God to look like. However, and Muslims, for example, may see Muhammad. Some see Jesus, some see just spirit guides, and others. It seems to suggest that that's what the mind is expecting. Not necessarily that the mind is producing it, but the mind. Okay, camera ran out of battery, which is strange, but never mind. Back on now. Right, here we go. I'll forget where we were.
Every continent and every age group have similarities when comparing afterlife experiences. When Dr. Parnia interviewed a 3-year-old boy who survived a cardiac arrest from an epileptic seizure he had, he said, "When I died, I saw a bright lamp." This aligns to the stories of adults seeing a bright light when confronted by death.
But interpreted in the mind's capabilities from a child's point of view.
The child also recounted that grandma came to meet me and said I was going to be okay. This is reminiscent to the guiding figure that many people see during their afterlife experience. Other children have described their experience after death as seeing a being of light. Maybe this is a marriage between the bright light and the guiding figure. There are no accounts of them describing the light as God, Jesus, or Santa Claus.
Yeah, generally because they haven't had the exposure to kind of the lifetime of expectation as to what to expect after death. Some kids do report seeing Santa, most don't.
Because as children, these concepts are not associated with death. Yet younger children report afterlife experiences similar to older children and adults. It's important to note that these experiences are not the same as sleep paralysis or locked-in syndrome, where people are conscious and awake but unable to speak or move.
Although sleep paralysis is often a stage of performing willful out-of-body experience. Although I've never had it, but there are reports that the sort of thing you're seeing on screen can happen, where it feels like something is stood on your chest, and you can have hallucinations where something is standing on your chest. And that's kind of the difference between hallucination and lucid experience that we describe in near-death experiences. That is a hallucination, for instance. Confusing, makes no sense, but happens, But with these near-death experiences, there is a chronology, as I say, and very high lucidity.
Researchers have ruled this out due to the fact that the patient's heart has completely stopped beating. During paralysis, the heart slows to a meditative state, but it never stops. The accounts from patients who have seen themselves on the operating table consist...
I've never heard of people sitting in kind of a semi-lotus position like that with their hands together. They usually just floating, confused, wondering what the hell's going on and worried that they're dead. Hence why a lot of people, or why nobody saw the targets really in the Parnia studies. Why would you look for a target when you're out of your body and you're panicking, wondering what the hell's going on?
Consistently state that they were in no pain. And
that, and most of the participants died or were too ill to be interviewed. Only one person was interviewed who did have veridical perception that was third-party verified, but it wasn't the target, so it was ignored. I don't understand, but so be it.
Oftentimes they were confused why everyone was worried about them. It's almost as if when you die, your mind and consciousness relaxes and all of that pain your body feels is cut off from your mind. Maybe this shows that your consciousness is not a part of your body at all. but just contained within it, waiting to be set free.
One
It's
possibility.
uncanny events like these that make Dr. Samparnia hypothesize that the psyche or self may not originate in the brain at all, but could possibly be a separate undiscovered entity. Parnia believes that consciousness could be some
Or a third option from idealism, purported commonly by Dr. I don't know if that's the right way purported, but given a lot by Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, is that everything is consciousness, and that the physical, I'm sorry Bernardo, I'm probably butchering it, but the physical is kind of a manifestation of that conscious experience when it's localized into one set of experience. So the physical body and the brain and the correlations of brain activity are all manifestations of consciousness. So the brain activity is what conscious experience looks like when it's localized into one physical kind of aspect. I think that's the general idea. I'm sorry, Bernardo, I probably completely butchered it, but that's
similar
what I
in
believe
nature
it
to
be.
electromagnetic radiation,
Your position
like
to be.
radio waves and visible light. There's no definitive evidence for what makes up consciousness or your psyche. But if it was something similar to energy waves, that would help explain observations that occur from outside the body, because energy is not confined to a corporeal form. Then again, if that's the case, why can't we just shoot our conscious selves out of our brain anytime we want? Now, not all afterlife experiences are equal.
Although sometimes we seem to be able to, but we have to be in a certain state. If we are performing willful out-of-body experience or astral projection, as some people call it, they can simply push their consciousness out of the physical body, so it would seem. But you have to be in a certain state, in a certain, they say, level of vibration. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but a certain meditative state, I suppose.
Or pleasant. During a study, one man recounted that
In fact, some people believe that dreaming is a form of our consciousness being on a separate, on another plane. I don't necessarily subscribe to that completely, but that is one possibility as well.
when his heart stopped beating and the doctors were trying to bring him back to life, he experienced the guiding figure. Except in this case, it was an unfamiliar woman. She was floating and beckoning him to join her from the ceiling in the corner of the room. Kinda creepy when you think about it. The man remembers thinking, I can't get up there. Then, as he finished the thought, he suddenly was up there, looking down at himself. He saw his blood pressure being taken and a breathing tube being put into his mouth. The nurse was giving him CPR. He could accurately describe the people, the sounds, and even the events leading up to his resuscitation. Other people
Can't use that as evidence though, because if resuscitation was being taken or was being administered and his blood pressure was being taken, clearly there was blood flow going on to his brain, so that could have allowed for conscious experience to take place. You know, the physical body recording sensory perceptions and creating a scene out of that kind of mentally. So you can't really use that as evidence, strong evidence anyway, unless there is kind of some unknowable piece of information given at the time, something that happened in a room a long way away, for instance.
People have recounted being sucked into a deep black void, almost like a star, being sucked into a black hole and torn apart. Clearly,
Torn apart. They experience being in a void of love. Usually they experience it. They don't usually have fear. I mean, if I was to imagine being floating in a black void of nothingness, that would actually terrify me. But that's not the experience that people have. They see it as like almost like I suppose like a womb of love. Like you feel like you're protected and you feel like you're safe and you're secure. It's not an unpleasant
really not
feeling
the most
of
reassuring
isolation.
afterlife experience, but it could be worse. There are others who have seen grotesque creatures that wail and moan in pain. They beckon the person toward them. Luckily, those people were brought back to life before they were forced to follow the creatures. But it begs the question, what happened to the people who experienced those visions and didn't get pulled out of it by doctors restarting their heart?
They may have experienced the same thing, because I believe that these are very mind. Oh, hello. Who's calling me? Hello? Carpet fitters for the new house. They come in Wednesday instead of Saturday.
Dr. Parnia is not a religious man and
No, he's
insists that his experiments are not to prove there is a supernatural afterlife. Instead, he aims to understand what happens to the consciousness after the body dies to avoid.
So even that word supernatural, I think, is very leading, because whatever the explanation is found to be, whether its consciousness is within the brain and it's kind of a form of hallucination, or that the consciousness is outside of the brain, it's still going to be a natural thing. It's still going to, by its nature, because it exists, it must be natural, by my definition of natural. It's just a form of nature that is, as of yet, not understood. So I struggle with that term, paranormal, supernatural.
Avoid disorders of the consciousness. This includes patients who are left in a permanent vegetative state after their brain is starved too long for oxygen. Parnia wants to prevent cases like this, while also testing the accuracy of the afterlife experiences using a scientific approach. Research shows that people who have these after-death experiences are often transformed by the experience itself.
To having a lot of money? I mean, that's not usually something I hear. I hear that people become a lot less materialistic, not in terms of philosophical materialism, but in terms of, I don't want all the money, nice houses, blah, 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 blah.
Change their lifestyle to help others and become less self-centered.
Yeah.
Parnia says patients who have died and been brought back to life view the world in a different way.
So left is
People
what they
who
were,
have an afterlife experience tend to have a shift in perspective that focuses on their humanity.
He needs a dentist, that bloke.
Parnia also reports that following an afterlife experience, people become more empathetic and reflective on things they've done, especially if their actions have hurt others. They often describe the experience from the other person's perspective, which causes emotional distress to themselves.
That's generally the life review.
Is this our consciousness reaching out to another consciousness? Do people who have experienced death literally have more connected worldviews? Whether you believe in the afterlife or not, scientists are finding more and more evidence that consciousness remains even after the body dies. Experiences that people have had while clinically dead are hard to explain.
Don't know why Mr. Wheelchair would be in a wheelchair there, because usually when people see their loved ones, they're usually in perfect health. Any kind of abnormalities or any disabilities are gone, and they're younger, back to being young. I suppose maybe she's out of her body and looking at these people because she recognises them in that state, but generally they become much more able-bodied and much younger and much fitter, much more healthy. But as I say, they might be in that way to I mean, it's not important, it's a bloody cartoon.
At this moment in time, it would seem that the frequency of shared afterlife experiences across the world and age groups would indicate something happens to you after you're clinically dead. We don't know what's in store for us after this life, but we do know that death of the body is not the end for our consciousness. Maybe something happens to you after you're clinically dead. We don't know what's in store for us after this life, but we do know that death of the body is not the end for our consciousness.
You can't say that. You can't say that we know that the death of the body is the end of consciousness. We don't. There's very good evidence to suggest that it may be. I believe it is true, but we can't say that it certainly is true. We know that experience seems to take place when the brain is in a state where it shouldn't be able to produce consciousness, but we can't say that we know that for a fact, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think it's more than reasonable with the evidence to suggest that it does. But what exactly that means, all we can say is, well, what happens to people when they are clinically dead, and even in the states where we know that the brain isn't functioning on an EEG recordable level, when they come back, we know that they experience something. We can't say, therefore, that permanent death is the same. You could, strongly induce that it may be, but if we're looking at it from a scientific approach, we can only see the experiences of those who have been brought back.
Maybe not even by a long shot. If talking about death doesn't freak you out too much, you should check out our video on what happens after.
I didn't wear underwear for a month, and this is what happened. Okay, so that was the Infographics show. Science experiment proves afterlife is real. Science experiment does not prove that afterlife is real, but it may provide evidence that it may be. What that is, we don't know, but it certainly doesn't prove it. But very important information for those who maybe are not familiar with the scientific work done on the subject. The Infographics show is a very popular channel currently, as I'm looking at it, 3 million subscribers away from 10 million, so 9.97 million, almost there. So go over and have a look at some of their videos, very informative and very important to get that kind of information across. Again, if you have any videos you'd like me to have a look at, any articles online that you'd like me to have a look at and to give my opinion on, just drop them to me in an email or on Discord or through the Facebook group or wherever else. I'm going through and trying to find some of these myself, but any suggestions is great. Hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you all on the next video. Bark. Bye-bye.